Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Whispering Walls. Emily had always dreamed of a fresh start. After years of living in cramped apartments and dealing with the noise of city life, she and her family were ready for a change. When they found the perfect house in a quiet neighborhood, it felt like a dream come true. The house was old, but well maintained, with antique wooden floors that creaked underfoot and a grand staircase that spiraled up to the second floor. The high ceilings and large windows filled the rooms with natural light. It was exactly what they had been looking for. They moved in within a week. Emily, her husband Daniel, and their two children, Lucy and Ben, were eager to settle in. They spent the first few days unpacking, cleaning, and decorating, but something about the house felt off. It wasn't that there was anything outwardly wrong with it. In fact, it was beautiful. But at night, there was an unsettling stillness in the air, a quiet that felt almost unnatural. The first sign that something was wrong came on the third night. Emily had just finished tucking in the kids and was sitting down to read a book when she heard it. A soft, almost inaudible sound, like a murmur. At first, she thought it was the house settling. Old houses made noises, creaks and groans that seemed to come from nowhere. But then it happened again, a soft whisper, so faint she could barely make it out. It was coming from behind the walls, probably the pipes, she told herself, trying to ignore it. The whispering continued every night, growing louder as the days passed. At first, Emily thought it was just her imagination, but then, on the sixth night, it happened again. This time, the whisper was unmistakable. It was her name, Emily. The voice hissed from behind the wall, low and drawn out. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard it clearly this time, unmistakably. Her name. The voice sounded almost familiar, but she couldn't place it. She stood up from her chair, her legs trembling, and walked toward the wall where the sound had come from. She placed her ear against the cold wood, listening intently. But the whispering stopped. The next few days were filled with an eerie sense of unease. Emily tried to dismiss the whispers as a trick of the house settling, or perhaps even a rodent trapped in the walls. But the whispers kept returning, growing louder with each passing night. At times, they seemed to be nothing more than faint murmurs, just out of reach of comprehension. Other times, they were clear and direct, calling her name in a voice that seemed to come from nowhere. One night, after hearing the whispers once again, Emily couldn't take it anymore. She walked down the dark hallway toward the source of the sounds, her heart racing in her chest. As she approached the wall, she felt a chill run down her spine. The whispers seemed to grow louder, almost frantic. "Emily, help me." Emily backed away from the wall, her hands shaking. Her mind raced. What was going on? Was she losing her mind? She went back to the living room, sat down, and tried to calm herself. She tried to tell herself it was just the house settling again, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. There was something in the walls, something that was trying to get her attention. The next morning, Emily decided to look into the history of the house. She went to the local library and began researching. The house had been built over a century ago, and it had changed hands several times. But there was one particular story that caught her eye. The house had once belonged to a woman named Margaret Sinclair. Margaret had been the last owner before the house was sold to the previous family. According to the old town records, Margaret had mysteriously disappeared one night, and no one had ever been able to explain what happened to her. Some believed she had run away, while others thought she had simply vanished without a trace. Her disappearance had remained a mystery, with no clues left behind. There were whispers of strange occurrences in the house during the time she lived there. Unexplained noises, flickering lights, and people feeling watched. As Emily read through the old articles, a shiver ran down her spine. Margaret's sudden disappearance was strange enough, but what really unsettled Emily was the note in the article that mentioned a local legend. Some say her spirit still haunts the house, trapped behind the walls where she died. Emily's blood ran cold. She had to know more. That afternoon, Emily went to the local historical society to dig deeper. There, she found more about Margaret's life. Margaret had lived alone in the house, and she was known to have been a reclusive woman who rarely interacted with her neighbors. Some said she was troubled, and others claimed she had been hiding something. Well, what? It wasn't until Emily spoke with an elderly woman who had once lived in the neighborhood that she learned the rest of the story. The woman, Mrs. Ellis, had been a child when Margaret lived in the house. She had vivid memories of strange events that happened while Margaret was there. Mrs. Ellis recalled hearing stories from her parents about loud noises coming from the house, and the eerie feeling that would wash over the neighborhood whenever Margaret would stand in the window, staring out into the street. But the most disturbing part of the story came when Mrs. Ellis mentioned the day Margaret vanished. People say she was trapped, Mrs. Ellis said, her voice trembling. Trapped in a house, behind the walls. They say she tried to escape, but something kept her there. Emily felt her stomach turn. Trapped behind the walls. It couldn't be a coincidence. The whispers, the strange feeling in the house. It all made sense now. That night, Emily sat in the living room, listening intently for the whispers. She had to know what was going on. As the clock ticked past midnight, she heard it again. The whispering, low and almost imperceptible at first, but then unmistakably clear. Emily, help me. Her heart raced, and without thinking, she stood up and walked to the wall where the whispers seemed to come from. She pressed her hand against the cold wood, her breath shallow, and waited. The whispering stopped. Emily's mind raced. She didn't know what to do. Was Margaret's spirit trapped here? Was it angry? Or was it simply lost, calling out for help? The next day, Emily decided to do something about it. She couldn't just ignore it any longer. She gathered her family and told them what had been happening. Daniel, though skeptical at first, agreed to help her investigate further. Together, they began searching the house for any hidden doors or passageways. And then, in the far corner of the attic, they found it, a small, hidden door behind some old furniture. With trembling hands, Emily opened the door. Behind it was a narrow, dark space, so small that it could barely be called a room. But what they found inside made Emily's blood run cold. There, in the corner of the tiny space, was a faded portrait of a woman, Margaret Sinclair. Beneath the portrait was a small, dusty journal, its pages yellowed with age. Emily opened the journal. and as she read the first few lines, she gasped. Margaret's writing was frantic, filled with fear and desperation. She spoke of being trapped in the house, of strange occurrences, of a presence in the walls that wouldn't let her leave. She wrote about hearing voices, whispers that called her name, just like Emily had heard. The last entry was the most chilling. I am trapped. I cannot escape. The walls are closing in. Emily's heart raced as she closed the journal. She knew what she had to do. Margaret's spirit was still here, still trapped, still calling for help. That night, Emily sat alone in the living room, listening intently. The whispers came again, louder this time. She spoke softly, calling out to the spirit. Margaret, I know you're here. I can help you. Please let go. The whispers stopped. For the first time in days, the house was silent. The next morning, Emily woke up to a sense of peace that had been absent since they first moved in. The air in the house felt lighter, the oppressive weight of the whispers gone. It was as if the spirit of Margaret had finally found peace. But Emily knew that the house would never be the same. She had heard the whispers, and she had helped the spirit move on. But the memory of the strange presence in the walls would stay with her forever. Story 2. The Crying Baby. Mark and Sarah had finally done it. After years of saving and searching, they had found their dream home, a quaint little cottage tucked away on the outskirts of town, far from the noise of the city. The house was small, but it was perfect. The garden was overgrown but full of charm, with roses climbing the side of the house and ivy draping the old brick walls. The large bay windows gave the living room a soft, natural light, and the wooden floors creaked in all the right places. It was the kind of place they had always imagined owning, a place to build a life and start their family. The first few days in the house were full of excitement. They spent hours unpacking, arranging furniture, and admiring the view from their bedroom window. At night, they would sit in front of the fire, sharing a bottle of wine, feeling the warmth and contentment of finally being settled. But on the fourth night, everything changed. It happened when they were just about to drift off to sleep. Mark was lying on his back, his arm around Sarah, who had her head resting on his chest. The night was quiet, too quiet. It had been a long day, and Sarah had just started to doze off when she heard it. A faint sound, almost like a whimper, a soft cry. Her eyes snapped open, and she listened carefully. The sound came again, this time louder. A baby, crying. It wasn't the kind of cry that filled the room with panic, but it was unsettling, strange, as though it was coming from far away, like a whispering echo through the walls. Did you hear that? Sarah whispered, her voice tight with confusion. Mark shifted in the bed, propping himself up on his elbows. What? The crying. It sounds like a baby. Mark furrowed his brow. A baby? He sat up fully, looking around the room. There's no baby. They both sat in silence, listening. The cry echoed again, faint and desperate, but unmistakable. Mark's heart started to race. He threw off the blankets and quickly climbed out of bed. Let's check it out, he said, his voice more urgent than before. They crept quietly down the hall, the sound growing louder with each step. The cry seemed to come from upstairs, from the direction of the guest bedroom. They reached the stairs and stood there, staring up into the darkness. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. "Nothing," Mark said, shaking his head. "There's no baby here." "Let's check the guest room anyway," Sarah suggested, her voice trembling. They tiptoed upstairs and opened the door to the guest room, half expecting to find a baby, somehow, crying in the middle of the night. But there was nothing. The room was empty, still, and quiet. Mark checked the closet. Sarah pulled back the curtains, but there was no sign of a child, alive or otherwise. Confused, they returned to their room and tried to settle back in, but neither of them could sleep. The cry, so faint but so real, lingered in the back of their minds. The next night, the crying came again. It wasn't as faint this time. It was louder, almost as if the baby was in the same room. Mark and Sarah both shot up in bed, their hearts pounding in their chests. They quickly got up and searched the house once more, but there was no baby, no crying child, only empty rooms and silence. "Maybe it's just the house settling," Sarah said, trying to calm herself down, but her voice shook. Mark wasn't so sure. "This isn't normal. It's not just a house." The cries continued every night. Always the same time, just after midnight. Always faint at first, then growing louder until it seemed like the baby was right in the house with them. They couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong. Desperate for answers, they spoke to the neighbors. The elderly couple next door, Mrs. and Mr. Turner, were more than happy to chat when they asked about the history of the house. "Ah, you've moved into the old Manson place," Mrs. Turner said, squinting her eyes as if she were recalling distant memories. "A lovely house, but it's got a past." "Past?" Mark asked. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Turner lowered her voice. "The family that lived there before you. They weren't there long. They had a baby, a little girl, I think. She passed away. Tragically." "What happened?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Turner looked around, as if making sure no one else was listening. "There was an accident. The baby drowned in the bathtub." She paused, letting the words sink in. "It was said that the mother was distracted and the child slipped under. They tried everything to save her, but it was too late." Mark and Sarah exchanged a look. It was the same house, the same history. "But what happened to the family?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "They left. They couldn't bear to stay after that. It's said that the baby's spirit never left the house. People say she still cries, waiting for her mother to come back." Mark and Sarah sat in stunned silence. So, it wasn't just the house settling. It wasn't just their imagination. The crying baby was real. A ghostly presence trapped in the home, forever wailing in the night. That night, the cries were louder than ever. They were no longer faint and distant. Now, it sounded like the baby was right next to them, screaming, crying, as if begging for attention. Mark and Sarah couldn't ignore it any longer. The house felt like a prison, the air thick with grief and sorrow. They tried everything to make it stop. They prayed, burned sage, even hired a local medium to come in and cleanse the house. But no matter what they did, the cries never stopped. The sound of a baby wailing echoed through the house, keeping them awake night after night, filling the rooms with its desperate cries. Weeks passed, and Mark and Sarah's lives slowly began to unravel. The crying never ceased, wearing them down. They couldn't escape it. They couldn't find peace. The house that had once felt like a dream was now a nightmare they couldn't wake from. One night, as Mark lay in bed, the crying seemed to grow more frantic, more desperate. He sat up, sweat dripping from his brow, and turned to Sarah. She was awake too, staring wide-eyed at the wall, her face pale with fear. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Mark nodded, his voice barely a breath. "It's here. It's right here with us." And then, as if in response, the cries stopped. The house fell completely silent. It wasn't a silence of peace, but a silence of waiting. A silence that seemed to hold its breath. And then the floor creaked, slowly, steadily, as if someone or something was walking toward them. Mark and Sarah lay frozen in terror, their eyes wide, hearts pounding. The baby's cry had stopped, but something much worse had begun. Story 3. The Shadow in the Basement. Jack and Olivia had finally found their dream home. It wasn't a mansion, but it had that old, cozy charm. Creaky wooden floors, large windows that let in streams of sunlight, and a backyard that could make any garden enthusiast envious. The house stood at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, tucked away from the noise of the city. The peace and isolation made it the perfect retreat for the young couple, who had just moved from a cramped apartment. From the outside, the house seemed perfect, but once they moved in, there was something about it that gave them an unsettling feeling. The first time Jack went down to the basement to check the water heater, he felt it. The air down there was different, thick, almost suffocating. It wasn't just the musty smell of old stone walls and damp concrete. It was a weight that pressed down on him, making the hairs on his neck stand up. And the shadows, they didn't behave the way they should. They shifted and twisted, almost like they had a life of their own. He tried to shake it off, but the feeling lingered. When he told Olivia about it, she brushed it off with a nervous laugh. "You're just imagining things," she'd said, giving him a playful nudge. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something about that basement wasn't right. It wasn't until a few days later that things took a darker turn. It had been a long day. Jack and Olivia had spent the afternoon unpacking boxes and getting things set up. They were exhausted, but as night fell and the house settled into an eerie stillness, Jack heard it. A creak, then another. It was coming from the basement. At first, he told himself it was just the house. Old houses always creak and groan, especially when they were settling into their new occupants. But these sounds were different, too deliberate, too regular. It sounded like something or someone was moving around down there. Olivia was already in bed, tired from the long day, but Jack couldn't ignore the noises. He stood in the dark hallway for a moment, staring at the basement door. The cold, heavy air seemed to seep from the cracks under it, and he could feel that familiar unease creeping over him again. Without saying a word, he grabbed a flashlight and slowly made his way down the stairs. The basement was colder than it had ever been before. Jack shivered as he stepped onto the concrete floor, his breath visible in the dim light. The flashlight beam danced across the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to twitch and move. Jack called out, trying to convince himself that it was just the house settling again. But the only response was silence. broken only by the soft creak of the floorboards above him. He walked deeper into the basement, his feet heavy against the cold ground. His heart raced as he swept the flashlight around the room. The beam landed on the far corner of the room, and for a split second, Jack froze. There, standing motionless in the corner, was a figure. It wasn't a person. It couldn't have been. The figure was tall, too tall, and blacker than the darkness around it. Its shape was vague, formless, like a shadow that had been twisted into something more solid. It didn't have a face, no eyes staring back at him, but Jack could feel it was staring at him all the same. It was waiting, his breath caught in his throat. The air in the basement seemed to thicken, pressing down on him. The temperature dropped even further, and Jack felt the cold seep through his skin. His hands trembled as he tightened his grip on the flashlight. Before he could move, the shadow shifted. It didn't step forward. It didn't move in any way that made sense. It just shifted like it was sliding across the space toward him, gliding through the air like a mist. Terrified, Jack stumbled backward. His heart pounded in his chest, and panic surged through him. He turned to run, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. The shadow's presence was overwhelming, like it was pulling the very life out of him, freezing him in place. But his survival instincts kicked in, and he forced himself to move. He bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind him with a loud thud. Jack leaned against the door, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard he tried to explain it away, he couldn't shake the image of that dark figure standing in the corner, staring at him with an empty gaze. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Jack tossed and turned, the image of the shadow haunting his every thought. Olivia woke up once, sensing his distress. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice groggy from sleep. Jack didn't know what to say. He didn't want to scare her, but he couldn't ignore what he had seen. "It's nothing," he muttered, pretending it was just a bad dream. He didn't want to admit that something was wrong with the house. Not yet. But the next morning, Jack knew he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. He needed answers. He and Olivia decided to look into the history of the house to see if there was anything in its past that could explain what was happening. They found it buried in an old newspaper article. The house had once belonged to a man named Gregory Miller, a local businessman who had mysteriously disappeared 25 years ago. His wife had claimed that he'd been working late in the basement one evening, but when she went to check on him, he was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no trace of where he had gone. But the basement was locked from the inside. When the police eventually forced the door open, they found nothing except for a note. It read, "The shadows are coming for me." Gregory Miller was never seen again, and his disappearance remained unsolved. The house had been abandoned for years before Jack and Olivia had bought it. The hairs on the back of Jack's neck stood up as he read the article. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but he didn't want to believe it. Was the shadow the spirit of Gregory Miller, trapped in the basement? Or was it something far worse? Something darker than just a restless ghost? The next night, Jack couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching him. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The shadow was real, and it was still there, waiting. He knew he had to confront it, but he didn't know if he was ready for what he would find. In the silence of the night, Jack heard the creak of the basement door. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. The air grew thick again, heavy and suffocating. The shadow was waiting for him, just as it had been waiting for Gregory Miller. And this time, it wasn't going to let him leave.